Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 26th of September and this is the Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm hosting the programme from sunny Kirkcaldy. First, we'll have a look at today's coronavirus update, then I'll introduce our two guests, and then together we'll look at the stories behind the news headlines from the past week together. As at 2 p.m. on Saturday, there were 3,261 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There were 18 new reported deaths of people who had tested positive for COVID-19. 4,172,573 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,824,074 have received their second dose. 1,005 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19 infection, 79 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 553,350 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and 8,532 patients who had tested positive have sadly died. Now, we're joined today by two regular and fantastic contributors and guests on the programme. Firstly, we're joined from Dundee by Siobhan Tolland. Siobhan is an activist, a writer, a historian and a disabilities advisor in Dundee. She is also one of the founders and is a member of Dundee Together, which is a community support group, which is now also working to welcome Afghan families to Tayside. Siobhan, good afternoon. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you? Glad to be on.
It's great to see you, Siobhan, and I'm doing fine, thank you. And secondly, we're joined today also by Paul McLennan, MSP. Paul is a Scottish National Party politician who's been the MSP for East Lothian since the election in May this year. He served as a local councillor for Dunbar and was both the SNP group leader and the council leader from 2007 until 2012. He's been a board member of NHS Lothian, the regional offices of Scottish Enterprise and the Commission on School Reform. And it's worth noting that Paul is East Lothian's first SNP MSP, with the constituency having been previously held by Ian Gray for the Labour Party since 1999. Paul, good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Andrew, I'm good. It's a nice day. I think it's the last few days of summer, so enjoying the sunshine and the warmth.
Excellent. Well, that's grand. Well, in East Lothian, you'll be absolutely right. It'll be fantastic where you are.
Yes.
Our first story today relates to the murder during the week of the East London school teacher Sabina Nessa. We've heard this morning that another man has been arrested. Two men having been arrested during the week and released under investigation by the Metropolitan Police, but there was a further arrest of a 38-year-old man in East Sussex in the early hours of this morning. But we're going to think a little bit more broadly about the circumstances of society generally, and and also to reflect on our society and the way in which events such as the murder of Sabina Nessa and the murder of other women reflects on us as citizens, as parents, as participants, and also to consider what it is that we might look at doing in order to address the problems that we see. Now, to put this into context a little bit, Scotland has about 12 murders per million of population. Those numbers are from 2020, and that's down from 19 murders per million population in 2010. So there's been a 36% reduction in the number of murders in Scotland over the last 10 years. In 2020, 76 people were accused of murder. 70 of them were men and 6 were women, and I think that's a very telling statistic. Also, of the 64 victims of murder in Scotland in 2020, 45 were men and 19 were women. And so that means that in Scotland in 2020, one woman was murdered every 3 weeks. And I should say that the equivalent number for England is a murder of a woman every 3 days. But we're talking about Scotland here, and as I say, the murder rate in Scotland is of a woman is murdered every 3 weeks in Scotland in 2020. Now we know that, and so that's simply to give context. The discussion this afternoon is really focusing on the societal and the cultural aspects of male violence. And the position of women and the interaction between men and women in our society in 2021. I know that in March 21, the Equality Network wrote to the UK Prime Minister raising serious concerns about Westminster's response to male violence. That was in advance of the murder of Sarah Everard over the summer, which attracted a great deal of attention. But Equality Now were really commenting on what they regarded as the tokenistic approach of politicians to male violence against women. And they were arguing that focusing on things like street lighting and wearing flat shoes and undercover cops in pubs really was tokenistic and was not addressing the root causes of the problems that we see. And so, Siobhan, I'm going to come to you first of all. You're the mother of a boy. So you've got relevant experience of young men. Paul and I have got relevant experience of young men, but although we're not such young men ourselves now. But Siobhan, what's your reflection on not necessarily directly on the terrible news of the murder of Sabina Nessa, but more broadly, what's your reflection on the state of our society in Scotland at the moment, and the rate of violence that we continue to see perpetrated by men against women in our society?
I mean, it's hard to know where to start with this because it's an incredibly complex, and I think it's a deep-seated issue that probably dates back centuries in this respect. I mean, raising a young boy, one of the things I've always tried to do, probably unsuccessfully, is create a kind of an idea in his head that difference is good, that we're all different but equal in many different ways, and we should respect those differences because that's what makes the world kind of go round, and that's what makes the world amazing, is that we're all different. From that, for me, I think it's about building a respect for individuals in relationships, but also collectively across the board. It just, as you were kind of saying this, it reminded me of something in the 2014 referendum and the reason that I wanted independence. And this maybe moves me on to the kind of wider societal issues. And part of the reason was I didn't want my son being brought up in a militarised culture that not only encourages a toxic masculinity, but actually actively requires it in order to send men out to war, to fight the wars that our society and that the UK have involved itself in. We've been involved in war in 170 countries since the Union. In 1707, we've invaded 90% of the globe. And the reason I say this is because we can talk about streetlights, all that kind of stuff. Yep, that's fine and good. We can also talk about what we can do as parents, what we can do within school, what we can do in terms of role models. But we do have a society and a culture that builds itself upon violence. We have a society that builds itself upon the process of war. If you look at the UK Brexit trade deal with Australia, well, what is that then? It's building submarines, war submarines powered by nuclear power. Okay, so we survive on a war culture. We can't teach our kids, or we can't teach men to behave well and respectfully against women if our society constantly tells us, subliminally and explicitly in all areas, that we get what we want through violence. The whole history of the UK Empire has been based on we enact violence to get what we want. It requires a radical reset of how we think about our society. And that might be very wide-reaching and not very practical in that sense, but until we actually begin to recognise that as a society we actively encourage violence, we encourage a dehumanisation of women across the board. Every single woman has experienced objectification across the board. That's from the very small and subtle to the getting followed and by creeps along the road to even worse. Okay, so we do have these kind of deep-seated issues. We have men that are brought up expecting to be violent, taught that violence is somehow a manly structure. These are the things that we need to start tackling now. The streetlight issue, I'm sorry, I say this because it's so insulting. It's insulting on so many levels. There's been a lot of kind of backlash here in that, isn't it? It's like what women have to do. Well, it's not just what men have to do as well, it's what society has to do, it's what our governments have to do in order to kind of redress that balance. We stop by glorifying war and letting people think that war is the way that we move forward and get what we want. That's the lesson I want my son to know, is that we don't run a society on violence, and therefore that, I think, reflects how individuals will respond. What society does, and I will finish, I promise, what society does is it offers limits of behaviour. If we constantly build a society that war gives us what we want, then the behaviour of individuals and collectives across the board will subliminally understand that violence is how we get what we want. Couple that with the objectification of women, then we have real problems, actually.
Thanks, Siobhan. As you say, the complexity and the multiplicity of the issues associated with this are many and are varied and are complex in themselves. But you've given us a great introduction there and some very important telling points to think about. Thank you. Paul, we know that at birth there's very little difference between the brains of men and women, and so that suggests to me that it must be culture that then leads men and women to act and to speak and to behave in so many different ways. What lessons do you think our current society is teaching boys and men, and what do you think we should change?
No, Andrew, I'd agree. I think it's very much cultural, and I think that's not easy to change. And I've got a boy and a girl, and we've talked about this. And it comes on the back of the murder of Sarah Everard as well, just a few months ago. And women shouldn't have to walk down the street and be scared if they see a man across the other side of the road. But that's the fact of where we are. It does start at home, I think. In terms of parenting, and you need to make sure that they're speaking to their kids at an early age. I think it starts at school also, because you get the situation, there's peer pressure and so on, and it's almost, I suppose, a sign of toughness if a man seems to be masculine, and I think that needs to move away from that. I think some other issues are around about, obviously, some murders are around about domestic abuse, and we need to make sure that there's support for women's aid and services in regards to domestic abuse as well. But a lot of it is cultural. It does need to change. For too long this has gone on, and I've asked my daughter and my wife, and like Siobhan, they've been the subject of different forms of abuse, whether it's men touching them, men following them, making remarks, which are just totally unacceptable. It's cultural, but it needs to start at home, needs to start at school. We need to back it up with legislation, and I think it is right. If you do have the case of streetlights and so on, it is a bit of an insult, and these are the small things, obviously, which would help. But if they think they're going to solve the problem by just looking at streetlights and making sure women wear flat shoes and so on, that's an insult to women. It needs to come from culture, it needs to come from legislation. And we need to make sure as a society, we make sure and say that it's not acceptable, because it's not. I've seen my wife and my daughter talk about this, and that's close to home. But every woman, I have no doubt, Siobhan said, has gone through that. And it's unacceptable, and we need to make sure that we continue as a society to move away from that. I think we've made small steps. There's much more progress to be made.
Thanks, Paul. What we'll do is we'll stay with you for our next story this afternoon, and that is the latest the latest episode of Brexit news, I suppose. In the course of the past week, since the last Full Scottish, we've had the continued soaring rise of energy prices as the UK is unable to purchase gas in the European markets. The European spot markets. We've now seen the logistics industry complaining even more loudly and more vociferously and more directly regarding the impact that both COVID and Brexit has had on the availability of HGV drivers and tanker drivers in particular within the HGV driving community. And also we've seen the ongoing complaints from the food production and processing industries of the shortage of the necessary manpower, with butchers and poultry processors and fruit pickers and vegetable pickers all said to be in short supply, such that productions are being reduced, or produce is being destroyed, or produce is being lost, and the impact that has. So, Paul, firstly with you, do you think could we have predicted these chaotic scenes as a result of Brexit?
Yeah, totally predictable. Yeah, totally predictable. I remember James Withers from Scotland's Food and Drink coming out and saying before Brexit, the Brexit date, that this would happen. And we've already seen issues a few months ago with getting our produce to market. I've seafood industries in my own area. I've been speaking to the farming industry, and the issue was getting to market. Obviously with the regulations that are there just now, so they're already suffering before we get to the situation about where we are just now. And the big problem in that regard is once you've lost that market, the market will go elsewhere. And I know Scotland's Food and Drink are particularly concerned about that. In terms of energy, we were warned about this would happen as well. And the road haulage issue has been an issue that's been going for the last 4, 5, 10 years sort of thing. But again, we were warned about foreign workers and so on, and that's the case. And we knew this would happen, and I asked a question in Parliament just a couple of weeks ago, about 10 days ago, asking about what are the labour shortages. We're moving away now from skill shortages to labour shortages, where we don't have enough people. We don't have enough people, and the solution, obviously, is having an independent Scotland where we can make our own rules. But at the moment, that needs to be, the Scottish Government needs to continue to push UK Government in regards to getting powers over our ability to bring in EU workers and overseas workers into Scotland, because we need them to serve our industry. But it's entirely predictable, and it's a real shame. And I think it really strengthens the case for independence. And I think we've seen that. And I think that this might be a crossing point in the next wee while. We've seen energy prices. We've seen issues about logistics. We've been warned that Christmas might be cancelled because they can't get food and produce to market. It's entirely predictable. The UK Government will have to backtrack, or the economy will come to a shuddering halt.
Thanks, Paul. Siobhan, in the same topic, in the same area, a cynic might say that this last week is further evidence that, in terms of the Brexit experiment, there was no plan, and there's been very little in the way of planning for implementation of any of the changes. And I think that Michel Barnier's book, which recounts the story of the negotiations, kind of underlines that. He certainly talks at length about the extent to which David Davis, who was Brexit Secretary at the time, made no preparations at all for the negotiations, let alone anything else. And it also strikes me this morning in this context, we've got Grant Shapps, the Westminster's Transport Secretary, beginning to blame the Road Haulage Association for stirring up concern and for stirring up trouble in the logistics industry. So it strikes me that we've got a combination perhaps of a lack of planning, a lack of preparation, a lack of implementation, and then that's maximised by an enthusiasm for blaming anybody else. Or everybody else, rather than taking responsibility and fixing the problem. So, Siobhan, do you think the past week's rolling, I won't use a strong word, the rolling news we've seen over the past week as a result of Brexit, do you think we're just going to see more of it and it's going to get worse in the run up to Christmas?
Yes, of course it will. I mean, because I was looking today. The General Secretary of the European Road Haulers Association says that even if Britain does relax its rules, as it looks like it is in terms of getting haulagers to work in the UK, it's unlikely that they'll want to come back. So we've kind of almost shut that road off now, and with a point of no return. Partly. These kind of the situation of the road haulages and the energy, these are European issues. There's Poland is particularly struggling for HGV drivers, but they have a European structure that they can tap into, that we, through our kind of desperate need to be isolationist, have isolated ourselves from those structures. So we are suffering worse in a European problem across the board because of Brexit. It's like Paul said, it's remarkable because we saw this coming a mile away. It's literally, do not put your wet fingers in an electric socket and then you go ahead and do it anyway. I mean, that we saw this coming a mile off. We were warned. It was literally screaming at us by every single expert and expert going that this is going to cause chaos, this is going to cause problems, and yet they went ahead and did it anyway. Lack of planning, there was absolutely no foresight, and there's no responsibility here. It's that it's beginning to blame everybody bar themselves, taking absolutely no responsibility for this chaos. Coupled with this, of course, what you've got is the hard right Brexiteerian government that's about to insert an austerity agenda, vicious austerity agenda against our poorest people. So it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult winter for our poorest and most vulnerables. please let's not talk about Christmas, because it makes it feel like it demeans it somehow, like it's some kind of Christmas movie and somebody's going to save the day. We're talking about people's lives where basically fuel and food has been hiked. People are going to lose their universal credit. They are going to be £100 like that a month worse off, and which impacts on their ability to buy food, clothing, and and heat, and all those essentials that people need. Who cares about a Christmas turkey? Let's make sure that these people don't suffer as a result of it. Paul makes a very good point. I think this is a brilliant example of why we need independence. It's a brilliant example of why we need independence in Europe, however, because it's that collective organisational principle that seems to be staving off the worst effects of these crises across Europe. And we need that. We need those kind of wide arms to kind of join with.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Andrew, can I?
Yes, Paul. Yes, Paul, of course.
Yeah, I think just to build on the point I made before, I think it creates opportunities. I think obviously Scottish Government's talking around about the opportunities around about trade hubs, looking at Warsaw and Copenhagen, and I think I know, in speaking to Angus Robertson, he's keen to expand that, and I think we should be doing that as quickly as we possibly can, and building up these trade hubs in the rest of Europe, preparing for independence. I think there's one word of caution as well that we have to be aware of, and I know Michael Russell's been talking about this, is obviously the transition from being a devolved country into an independent country. We need to make sure we're progressing with these as much as possible. That maybe be around about a central bank, it's maybe looking at embassies and so on. We need to be prepared as quickly as we can when we move into an independent country. We've got almost a Scotland, an independent Scotland in waiting, and I think Michael Russell's working on that. We have to make sure that we're ready to step into that from day one, and start building on an independent country as quick as we can. We've seen a UK which wasn't prepared in any way, shape or form, and stuck its head in the sand, hoping everything would turn out for the best. And we knew it wouldn't, but we can't be in the same position. We've got to an independent Scotland, and we can't be complacent about that either. We have to be ready to move in. We have to be in a position where we're ready to trade as quickly as we can, open up international links, and basically operate as an independent country as quickly as we can.
That's a very good point, Paul, and I'm pretty sure that's a point we're going to come back to as we move closer and closer to 2023. So thank you. That's just great. Siobhan, I'll come to you now with our next story, and that really, I suppose, is the latest update of Muppet news. And I'm thinking in particular of the Prime Minister's speech in the UN Council during the week. It struck me as a speech that very much was looking at the world through the prism of Boris Johnson. His speech spoke about stealing the keys for the drinks cabinet as a teenager. It spoke about being a rebellious teenager. It spoke about the Greek god of wind, Boreas. And of course, he's also spoke about the Muppets, all of which was greeted by the UN Council with what I think can only be described as deafening silence. It struck me that that speech in particular seemed to be, as I say, almost through the prism of Boris's own personal experience in life, and I'd suggest that particular prism, which is a very particular prism, doesn't really translate very well to somebody who's not been to Eton and not been to Oxbridge. So why do you think he was trying to communicate to the UN Council in a way that we in Scotland struggle to understand, let alone political representatives from around the world?
If I could understand the brain of Boris Johnson, I think I would probably, no offence, I would be kind of talking across the world about this. I genuinely thought this was a joke when I first heard. I genuinely thought it was a joke. I thought it was just people. I didn't understand the Muppet references that were coming up on Twitter, and then I began to realise. But this is comic theatre. Across the globe. It's been tried in the UK, and now it's kind of happening there. I mean, it's not the first time he's done ridiculously stupid speeches with incredibly stupid references, but it's theatre and it's distraction, actually, with all due respect. He talks on the one hand about being grown up and then talks about a Kermit reference. It's distraction from what they're actually doing, and it's kind of, we're all talking about it now, but we should be talking about what's going to be happening with the energy crisis, what's going to be happening with the austerity agenda, what's going to be happening in this winter when people can't get food and heating. These are good distracting issues, and I think that it's very Trumpian, extraordinarily Trumpian in its characterisation, isn't it? Is say something ridiculous and everybody talks about it, and then underneath you've got all these things happening that we all kind of tend to forget about. He's a clown, but there's I think the strategy there underneath, it might not be him bringing it in, but there's an infrastructure of a strategy there that is basically trying to avoid, again, back to Brexit, the responsibility of their actions and what they're doing. The other point here is, do you believe a word that he said about his commitment to climate change? Well, I think the people of Scotland pretty much don't. Whether Europe does is another issue, or whether the UN did is another issue as well. But who knows about the mind of Boris Johnson? Honestly.
Thanks, Siobhan. My apologies for taking you into the mind of Boris Johnson there.
It was not nice.
Well, my apologies. Paul, coming to you now, one other aspect of the Prime Minister's visit to the US this last week was his discussions with Joe Biden and his appearance in meetings in the White House. Now, I was very struck by a photograph that was a press photograph that was published of one of those meetings in the Oval Office with President Biden and the usual raft of West Wing functionaries and advisors. What struck me was that, and this really ties back to the point that Siobhan was making about performative politics and the lack of substance, perhaps. It struck me very clearly that there were probably 25 or 30 people in the photograph, all of whom were wearing a mask, except the Prime Minister. So do you think, is it performative? Do you think, is he playing to his base? Is he just trying to trigger the Liberals? I mean, as what Siobhan was saying, it looked kind of Trumpian. Why do you think Boris is behaving like this?
I've seen the picture as well, and I think it's a mixture. I think it's a mixture of arrogance. He thinks he can do whatever he wants, and nobody can tell him. In that regard, I think it's ignorance. I think he's in another person's country. Most of them are wearing masks. He should be doing the same, and I think it's part of his upbringing as well. That he's better than other people. And I think we've seen the way that he speaks to people and mixes with people. It just it doesn't put. And you're right. It's almost Trumpesque in its approach. It's arrogance, and it doesn't do the UK any good. And obviously Scotland's implicated in that, unfortunately, at the moment as part of the UK. Hopefully not for much longer, but I think one of the key telling things was he walked away with his tail between his legs, because the trade deal that he was touting just a few months ago is nowhere near been progressing at all. And I think obviously Joe Biden is very strongly in the protocol around about Northern Ireland as well, and quite rightly so. And I think that's that's an indication about where he is, and I think that's maybe just because of the way he's reacting. It's almost he knows he's in trouble. He's not going to get the US trade deal he thought he would get within months. And he's now almost, slumming his nose at his host. So I don't think it was a good trip for Boris Johnson at all. I think it weakened his position on the international scene. And I think he's already seen as being a bit of a clown, as Siobhan said, across the EU and the way he handled Brexit and so on. It doesn't do the UK any good, it doesn't do Scotland any good. And again, it's a further strengthening the case for independence. Scotland would be an internationalist country, with a much more open look at what's happened, rather than where we see with Boris Johnson with his arrogant, ignorant approach to everything, basically. But particularly on his trip to the States, didn't go down very well, I don't think.
Absolutely, Paul. Thanks, Paul. And it struck me one other thing, Siobhan, in the context of green politics, you touched on it. Whilst he was in New York, Johnson said that, he was attempting to apologise for climate change sceptical articles that he's written in the past, and his explanation, and he was trying to suggest that he's changed his mind, and the explanation he gave was that the facts had changed, and so he had changed his mind. Now, I would argue that the facts haven't changed at all. It's just, maybe the only fact that's changed is that the sound of the alarm bells has got louder and louder and louder as the climate crisis becomes more and more apparent. So, you queried before whether Johnson could be trusted on green politics and trusted to deliver. He says he's changed his mind. Do you think he's changed his mind?
Boris Johnson changes his mind like 20 million times a day. He literally goes with the wind, and this is why you can't trust him, because he tries to, he basically just says what he says off the top of his head without any kind of thought or care, and that's part of the theatre, I think, of it as well. But no, and more importantly, actually, it's not just me that doesn't trust him. The people of Scotland don't trust him, and they don't trust him as far as they can throw them. They didn't trust him before COVID, and they certainly don't trust him now. So it's the people of Scotland that don't trust him. So, in that respect, in fact, we barely listen to what he says anymore, because it just literally, because we know there's no merit, there's no substance behind what he says.
Thanks, Siobhan. We'll move on now, and Paul, I'll come to you. We know that the Labour Party conference is beginning the British Labour Party conference is beginning in Brighton at the moment, and there's concerns continuing to be expressed that the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, seems still to be concerned only with fighting amongst itself rather than being in opposition to the government in Westminster. Now, we know that political infighting is a fact of life, and aligning those with political ambition is not always easy. But it seems that the British Labour Party has been unable to stop being paralysed by paroxysms of infighting and factionalism. Do you think that there's a prospect of that factionalism and infighting coming to an end, and the British Labour Party presenting an opposition in Westminster, or are they now locked into a spiral of decline?
I think it's bubbling under at the moment, Andrew, and I think we've seen that for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, we've seen Keir Starmer's push about amending the voting system within the Labour Party, which hasn't gone down too well, and I think he's going to abandon that. So I think that's point one. I think point two, he tried to almost reinvent himself with his essay that came out. I think it was one mention of Scotland, or two mentions of Scotland, about the same with Wales. I seen him being interviewed on Wales today, and it was I felt actually embarrassed for him. You know, he mentioned around about. He was asked why he only had a few mentions. He says, "Oh, he's been driven by the Welsh politics in the past." Couldn't answer the question. So there's a total disregard for Wales and Scotland in that regard. And I think we just seen in the last few days Katie Clark coming out, and she talked previously. A Labour MSP talked around about if the will of Scotland is to have a referendum, then they should have that, which is not the position of the Labour Party. And also just yesterday talking around about having the power of veto over international policy. And defence policy. So I think there is that tension within the Labour Party, and I think Angela Rayner, have you seen some of her speeches in the last week as well, where she was snubbed by Keir Starmer, is positioning herself as well for what happens after him. So it's not a party that I don't think has its own narrative, can't define its own narrative either here or in the rest of the UK. And I again coming back, and I'll tie this back to independence. Consistently, there is no prospect of a Labour government either in the next election or even the election after that. So we have a choice. It's either an independent Scotland, it's not going to be the Labour Party, or Boris Johnson. And that's what we have to say to people who are still remain to be convinced about independence. It's Boris Johnson, or choose a government of our own making.
Thanks, Paul. And thinking about the nuts and bolts and the nature of running political organisations and political parties, you touched on one aspect yourself, and I'll ask you about that. Do you think is the proposed change, which may now not happen, the proposed change to the way in which the Labour Party appoints its leader, was it necessary to try and have that fight now? Why do you think Sir Keir Starmer was keen to bring that forward and attempt to get conference to reverse the position? A relatively recent position.
Yeah, Andrew, I've seen that. I mean, I think Labour had moved towards one member, one vote before, and moving away from it, I don't understand why. Your activists are what's going to win the election. I know Labour Party have had the unions and so on, but your activist base is what, we can do whatever we want in regards to policies and press and publicity and so on. It's your activist base that win elections, and this is the same for any party. If you start to neglect them and start taking them for granted, you're going to decline, and I think it's a big mistake. And I think it further adds on people's view of him. If he's asked around about, who's seen as the best prime minister, he comes third behind the don't knows. So and I think he's really struggling to establish himself, and trying to publish a 14,000-word essay to try and re-establish about who he is and what the Labour Party stands for is a sign of weakness. And again, instead of strengthening him, I think it's weakened his case, much stronger than that. So he's really struggling. There's no relevance, I think, in Scotland. I think we're seeing that in the last opinion polls. There's been no change at all.
Thanks, Paul. And Siobhan, I'll ask the same question to you. Do you think that the events that we're seeing playing out in Brighton at the moment indicate that the British Labour Party, either in the UK or its branch office in Scotland, do you think these events indicate that the party has the chance of getting a grip and offering an opposition, or is it stuck in a spiral of decline?
Yeah, I think it's probably telling us the exact opposite. I mean, Keir Starmer seems to be bent on a kind of a leftist purge, and misunderstood. I think, because obviously Jeremy Corbyn kind of was unsuccessful, but I think he misunderstood that it wasn't actually necessarily a left issue. It was more of a kind of an inability to modernise a left position beyond 1970, which was always Jeremy Corbyn's position. He couldn't really dig himself out of that 1970s socialism that he kind of buried himself into. It was an issue of modernity rather than the left, I think. But Keir Starmer's just gone head on, and I think his attempts to change the voting system was an attempt to curb that. That's never a good thing when you're beginning to kind of try and literally kind of squash kind of half your base, and give what he wanted to do was the MPs much more power. You'll remember the massive struggle between Jeremy Corbyn and the grassroots and the MPs way back then as well. But picking up on what Paul says, we're looking at this from Scotland. There will not, and I absolutely agree with Paul on that, there will not be a Labour government in the UK, and either in England or in Scotland for the next decade. That is absolutely certain. The Labour Party in Wales has had the foresight to kind of, I think, modernise itself and kind of bring on board, I think, the consensus building that I think that the SNP has tried to do. But we're looking at this and we know that it's going to be 10 years of Tory rule, and that's all we've got. We've got a government an opposition in Scotland that never wanted to be in government. We had the Labour Party that weren't even, they were talking during the last election there, they knew they weren't going to win. It never even crossed their minds that they would form a government. So they have no experience, no understanding, no skill, and no even expectation of leading. There is nothing else now apart from post-Brexit Westminster government, an SNP Green-led independent Scotland. These are the two choices on offer. Labour Party government or a Labour government in either situation is off the table, and it has been for quite a while now, but it's never been more certain, I think, over the last kind of couple of weeks with Keir Starmer's kind of almost attempt to initiate division. Actually, it's bizarre, but the Labour Party have been doing that. They've been shooting themselves in the foot across the board. The Scottish Labour Party has been doing it since before the referendum, and the Labour Party seems to be following in that suit as well. But these are the two options on the table now. It's the only two options that are possible, and unfortunately for the people of Scotland, they're going to have to choose between those two. I feel for them, for those that are undecided, but that is the options on the table. The Labour Party will never gain power in the foreseeable future in either Scotland or England.
That's an interesting point that you make, Siobhan, with regard to consensus building. Over the next few items that we're going to talk about this afternoon, on the one hand, there's an argument that we're seeing political organisations splintering. We've seen it. I think we've seen it in Iceland. Iceland's was at the polls yesterday. There's an argument. We've seen it in Germany. I think you might say there's an argument. We saw it in right-wing politics in the UK with the rise of UKIP, which was then became irrelevant as the Tory party chased those votes and lurched to the right. And arguably we've seen division amongst the independence movement in Scotland over the last 12 months. So on the one hand, you were talking about consensus building, and I understand that, and I can see that that's what's necessary in order to take power. But at the same time, we're seeing political organisations and movements in a number of European countries splintering at the moment. How do you think that can be resolved in order that some more political change can be achieved?
Sorry, is this me or Paul?
Yes, for you, Siobhan, first of all. Sorry.
Sorry. Do you mean across Europe, or do you mean within Scotland?
Whichever you think you'd like to comment on.
Okay. I mean, I think that, Scotland's maybe moving towards less division, actually. I would say that the alliance has solidified, the cooperation between the SNP and the Greens has solidified a government and a structure and an infrastructure that's independent at its heart within the Scottish parliamentary system, to the likes of which we've never quite seen before. And I think that what that's done is created kind of consensus and created solidity rather than division. I know that within the movement, perhaps there is some fringes that are perhaps unhappy, but actually, I think that the role now is to unify Scotland. and to bring everyone in Scotland with us on the journey for the next 10 years. And going back to what Paul said about the two choices, we have two choices, and we need to unite behind the choice that is open to us if we're independent supporters. And I think that the work has been done on that, and Paul mentioned earlier on about the infrastructure that needs to kind of get going immediately the day that we kind of decide we're going to be independent, and I've no doubt that we will make that decision. But the infrastructure's there, and what we've got is a kind of post-COVID recovery in all its elements, in its anti-poverty elements, in its kind of green movement elements, in its European base, that has independence at its infrastructure heart. So every kind of element of our post-COVID recovery is now defined by pro-independence structures within Scotland, and that is why I think that independence is becoming almost inevitable. It's not the settled will yet, as Professor McEwen said, but I think we're definitely getting there. So I look at this from actually a positive sense. I will point out that, you know, part of my PhD was studying the British left, so I know division, right, left and centre. There's no division compared to that. You know, we just need to look at the Labour Party to understand that one. But I think that actually there's unity in moving forward. And it's not just unity within the movement, because I think the movement is dispersed somewhat now. It's unity for people across Scotland. I think that the identity of what Scotland is has changed, and that is a unifying force. It's way beyond the movement now. It's about unifying Scotland, and it's about actually making sure that we're all safe and secure as we move into the post-COVID recovery. That has independence at its heart. That's the unifying principle, I think, that wins us independence.
Great, Siobhan, thank you. Sense. No, it absolutely does. And in addition to it making sense, you've also provided the absolutely perfect segue into the next story. So I'm doubly grateful to you for that as well. Excuse me. Excuse me. Paul, thinking now about unity in the independence movement and thinking about the coming year or 2 years, we've, as Siobhan said, we've had solidification with the Butte House Agreement, which appears to be working and it seems to have stuck over the past couple of weeks since it was ratified by the two parties and came into force. We've now, because that's working at a national level at the moment. From conversations I've had with local councillors, they may be feeling some local authorities there's not yet a similar level of cooperation between the SNP and the Greens at a local level, and they are perhaps suggesting that in some local authorities that would be a good thing. So, Paul, first of all, do you think is there room for more unity and more cooperation in the Yes movement, and is there a prospect of more cooperation and more unity in the Yes movement as following on from the Butte House Agreement?
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say, I mean, you know, we obviously had discussions with the First Minister when this was first raised, and you know, obviously, there was the pros and cons that was discussed, and I think one of the biggest pros, obviously, was looking into how it would strengthen the independence case. And of course, the biggest pro was obviously looking at in terms of what can we do to drive the green agenda forward, and that, and I think we'll be defined as a parliament around about one through when we move towards independence, but two, what are we doing in terms of the climate emergency that's going on just now? So I think that strengthens in the case, and that's noticeable in the parliament. And the Labour Party and the Tories absolutely hate it. They don't like it at all. They refer to it as the coalition of chaos, and of course somebody then pointed out, talking around about partners, about the DUP, who are obviously partners with the Tories at one stage. So the Tories and Labour absolutely hate it. So I think it has strengthened the case for independence. There's a pro-Indi majority that we know, which is now been confirmed in the Parliament in terms of the green agenda. And we've got to remember who our audience is in the independence debate and referendum as well. And a lot of these are young voters who really pushing towards the green agenda, and I think that's really important. In terms of the broader debate, I think the councillor base, and I'm still a councillor, as you said, until next year. I think there needs to be discussions with Green colleagues in regards to that as well, because I think a very strong result in the council elections will see that case further strengthened, and I think that's really important. In terms of the broader discussions, I think, one, we've got to concentrate on what are the main reasons we're looking for independence? It's to tackle the issues around about what the Tories are trying to do about universal credits. It's to tackle the issue about having Trident in Scottish soil, spending hundreds of billions of pounds rather than tackling inequalities and poverty. And that's the real, that's the real prize for me. And we've got to focus on that. There's always going to be frictions and debates and discussions within movements. Whether it's to the left or to the right or whatever. That's just politics. That's human nature, unfortunately. What we have to focus on is how we first secure that referendum, how we win it, and let's focus on who the real issue is around about that. It is Boris Johnson and the Tories. It is the Labour Party, which isn't going to change. It is the choice between Scotland or a UK run by the Tories, and it's a choice around about a fairer, more equal Scotland against the Tory government, which, quite frankly, it doesn't tackle poverty, spends hundreds of billions of pounds on Trident, and is an international policy which, quite frankly, is disgusting when it supports the Saudi government bombing Yemenis. That's not the kind of country I want to be. I want a free, independent Scotland where we can make our own choices, and we have to focus on that. And I would urge everybody within the independence movement, that's our prize, that's our goal, that's what we can win.
Thanks, Paul. And Siobhan, I'll come back to you to think a little bit further about the Yes movement in Scotland in particular. We've seen over the past couple of years the appearance of a number of small parties and then who then didn't stand at the last general election in Scotland in May. However, the Alba Party did stand on the list. We've seen in the independence movement, we've seen a rise or an increased volume from a number of commentators, bloggers, who have played a role in the independence movement, even if it is only online. But they have. I think it's fair to say that they have played a part. Do you think, thinking now about the way in which the Alba Party was unable to cut through at the election in May, and actually, as I say that, I'm thinking of the hours that you and I spent talking about those results on a Saturday back in May. I'm sure this chair, the chair in this studio, still bears the marks of my having sat in it for 8 hours. But we'll move on. In terms of the way in which the independence movement in Scotland is evolving, as I say, with political parties coming into existence and then not perhaps cutting through at the general election, and as Paul was alluding to, we have local authority elections coming up next May. What are your predictions, Siobhan, for the independence movement, perhaps between now and next May?
I mean, I'm usually quite, I kind of tend to, I usually look at things from a kind of historical lens, and I think that, smaller parties, pro-independence parties are an inevitable part of the evolution of a movement. I think that it's been quite remarkable how solid the movement has been, considering it kind of held such a wide and disparate and wide-ranging types of politics amongst it. So in that respect, clinks and kind of changes and fringe parties, etc. That it's inevitable, and it's a normal part of the movement, I think. I think, though, that, and you picked up on that point and alluded to it, that I think that we do need to distinguish between the politics of an online culture and the politics of an actual real life society. And I think that I think that there's an element of the movement, and I hate using that word now, because I think that the movement, the more we talk about this movement, the more we seem to separate ourselves from the people of Scotland. And I think that we've kind of moved into that maybe slight arena where this kind of online structure of a movement and so forth is almost like a closed shop in terms of the believers of independence. I think that I'm trying to kind of formulate this, and I've been trying to write about this for quite a while, but it's taken a while to kind of articulate the thoughts that a successful movement builds alliances, a successful movement builds outwards, a successful movement seeks consensus across the board in a country, okay? But ultimately, a successful movement is no longer required, because what happens is the goals that the movement seek become part of the infrastructure and the common sense understanding within society in general. I think that the COVID pandemic has shifted the movement. It's realigned the movement partly to incorporate a much wider sense of people within Scotland. I think that Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government did that remarkably well, almost because they put the movement aside and said, we're going to concentrate on Scotland now. What's happened then is that the SNP no longer lead the movement, they also lead the people of Scotland. That has to change your strategy. It has to change your understanding. We have to work for everyone now. So when we talk about the movement, I almost feel now like it's slightly separated from the people of Scotland. I do think that's maybe what's causing a bit of friction, though, is that there's a sense that parts of the movement that are moving towards Scotland in general are kind of feeling like it's leaving other sections behind. So I can see where the tension is built there, but I think we're almost there in terms of the movement. We're almost no longer required as a movement, if that makes sense, because we have become, or independence has become, almost a common sense understanding of how a society should work. And the Green SNP agreement does that. The post-COVID recovery does that. We are leading the agenda now on how we build a post-COVID recovery. So there's an element there of our success is almost because we have just incorporated ourselves against the population of Scotland. We've become the common sense understanding of how we move forward.
Thanks, Siobhan. I knew I could rely on you to bring forward that kind of analysis, and I'm very grateful to you. And I look forward to reading when your thoughts finally coalesce completely. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts and analysis in further detail. We're going to change for a moment. Since we came on air, there's been some news breaking in Iceland. I touched upon it earlier on, and Reuters are reporting now. So we'll add a story in just now, and that is that Reuters are reporting that women candidates have won the majority of seats in the Icelandic election. Iceland's ruling left-right coalition strengthened its majority after a national election that for the first time saw more women than men elected to the Icelandic parliament. The final results showed, having been declared this afternoon. Opinion polls had forecast the coalition would fall short of a majority, but a surge in support for the centre-right Progressive Party, which won 5 more seats than in 2017, pushed its total count to 37 seats in the 63-seat parliament, according to the Icelandic state broadcaster RUV. Voters in Iceland elected 33 women to parliament. That's up from 24 in the last election. And Iceland was ranked the most gender-equal country in the world for the 12th year running in a World Economic Forum report released in March. So, Siobhan, rather than coming to you, Paul, as an elected politician, both as a councillor but also sitting in Scotland's Parliament, what's your initial reaction to the news of the election in Iceland, and in particular the election of the largest number of women to the Icelandic Parliament since the Parliament started?
Yeah, I think regardless of what the political colour is, I think that's fantastic news, and it's a major step forward. And any parliament should reflect gender balance. First and foremost, it's not just gender. We're talking about, if it's race, if it's religion, and so on. There has to be that balance. A parliament should reflect, the mix of its country. And Scotland made some progress towards that, and so that that's great news, I think, and it's a lesson for us all. And I think when we've seen post financial crisis Iceland as well with its constitution. When it involved all its citizens, I think there's lessons to be learned there as well in terms of if Scotland the UK doesn't have a constitution. As we move towards it, there's lessons for Scotland to learn about that and about how we get our constitution up and running as well. So no, I think that's fantastic news. And Scottish Parliament made some progress just in 4 or 5 months ago. We need to make sure we continue that and encourage people to come into politics from whatever area of Scotland they come from, and whatever their background is, and I think that reflects well on the Parliament. So well done to Iceland. I had the pleasure of being in Reykjavik a few years ago. Fantastic country. You get that real feeling that the push towards equality. It's an open, transparent country, and it's a lesson what a small country, independent country, can do. 300,000 people. So good on them and well done to them. Thanks,
Paul. And for our final story today, I'll stay with you, and we'll talk a little bit more about European politics. And of course, the people of Germany are going to the polls today. And with the retirement of Angela Merkel, who really has dominated European and EU politics for the last 16 years, we now see a changing of the guard in Berlin. And we see Armin Laschet, who portrays himself as the natural successor to Angela Merkel. He's the president of the Conservative Christian Democratic Union, and he's regarded as very much sharing Angela Merkel's centrist pro-European instincts. the Social Democrat Olaf Scholz is leading the SDP, and they moved ahead of the Angela Merkel's CDU for the first time in 15 years in recent polling, and he's certainly gone through a change since he replaced the Conservative Wolfgang Schäuble as the finance minister. Schulz has very much distanced himself from the very gruff and anti-Southern European rhetoric that Schäuble became famous for after the financial crisis in 2008. And of course, we have Annalena Baerbock, who is the leader of the Green Party. And for her, the chancellorship seemed briefly a real possibility in April as the Green Party raced to shock leads in the polling in April. However, and that was really provoked by discussion of the imminent replacement of Angela Merkel. However, the Greens have dropped back in the polls. So a very simple question after that very, very brief introduction, Paul. Who do you think will replace Angela Merkel?
Andrea, I think first of all, to comment on Angela Merkel, I didn't agree with her politics, and it's right of centre, but you can't deny that she's been a stable source in German politics for 16 years, and I think that's always going to be an issue for any country that has had a leader for that period of time. I think it will be a government that's led by Olaf Scholz, and I had a look at the polls just before it came on, and the closing poll had the SPD 26%, 5% ahead of the CDU, and the Greens on, I think, 16%. But if that transpired in the States, they would just be short of forming the government, and there's a possibility, obviously, looking at the left, the Linke, so, that would take them over the majority. And again, you've also got the FDP who could be in there as well. So I think it will be led by Olaf Scholz. Quite what that'll look like, I'm not sure. I'm sure the Greens will be involved, and I think that's a major step forward for left of centre and green politics in Europe, and I think that's obviously been shown with what we've done in Scotland with the cooperation agreement with the Greens. So I think that's good news. It's a left of centre government. I think there's been a move towards left of centre politics in the last few months, year and so on in Europe, which I think is, again, coming out of post-COVID. I think people can, it needs to be more of a societal approach, and let's look after our most vulnerable in our societies, and that was exposed by COVID. But I do think it'll be led by Olaf Scholz. I think the Greens will be involved. Hopefully they'll get enough to get them over to get a majority. If not, I think it'll either be a minority government, or they may ask either the FDP or the Linke to come in and form part of that. That'll prove difficult, I think.
Thank you, Paul. And I should have said that, as you say, in addition to the three parties I touched on there, the FDP, the AfD and Linke are all contesting the German election as well. So very briefly, Siobhan, I'll ask you the same question. Who do you think will be the next German Chancellor replacing Angela Merkel?
Yeah, it's on a knife edge, isn't it? But yeah, the latest poll is exactly as Paul said. So, we do have an opportunity here for there to be a kind of slight leftist, social democratic and green alliance. And I'm picking up again what Paul said as well about it's beginning to feel that we have, across Europe, that we have staved off the ultra-right on a kind of global level, and it feels like there is a shift of the slightly smaller countries moving towards more social democratic and left-to-centre politics as well. I would love to see the SPD and the De Grünen join forces and see what they could do. I think it's probably massively important as to how Europe will push forward in terms of the climate crisis as well. I think that it would be an extremely positive thing if that was to happen. I will be looking out for the results, as I have been looking out on Tenor Roots for the Iceland results as well. But I do think what happens in Germany will certainly set the tone for what happens in Europe over the next few years as well. Didn't quite agree with Angela Merkel's politics, but absolutely, I've never met anybody that hasn't respected her solidity, her sense of understanding, and her compassion, actually, and her just sheer intelligence. The images of her and Donald Trump together will go with me in comedy for the rest of my life.
Absolutely, Siobhan. Thank you. That's a good point that you make, and that's the last of the stories and the news that we're going to discuss together today. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here at 7 o'clock on Monday evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in. I hope that you've enjoyed your full Scottish today. Thank you to Siobhan and to Paul for joining us today and for sharing their thoughts and their input and their analysis, for which I'm extremely grateful. And thank you too for joining us today on the Full Scottish. I hope that you have a very peaceful weekend.